Hi everyone, today we're going to be going over the long-awaited service for the QuickFlight device. First off, we're going to start with the bench arm and the fixture itself. For QuickFlight to be able to compensate for the added height of the device, we've made a larger bench arm post. It's taller here, and then for the actual arm on the bench fixture itself, we've added this adjustable knob and set screw. This will allow you at your service center to adjust for the height of any head rush device just by unscrewing or screwing in the threaded knob here and then just feeling for tension within the clamp. And then once you've found that good spot, you want to tighten this nut down to the bench arm itself, and then just tighten it with some channel locks to make sure that it doesn't come loose during service. Now that we have that pin set, we will begin service. So just as always, we're going to begin with the spring side of the device. So we'll just prior to bringing the arm down, we will check torque on our shaft nut, 47 Newton meters. And then I'm actually going to also remove the ripcord from the webbing. And to do that, we're just going to use our T-handle here and remove the screw from our Petzl ring. And set the screw and the insert to the side, and then just slide off the ripcord. And then we'll do the same thing for the secondary webbing as well, the secondary attachment point. And then we'll slide off the ripcord off of this Petzl ring as well, and then we will set this to the side. We will come back to the ripcord inspection a little bit later. I'm actually going to take the Petzl rings off entirely. During this process, we like to inspect the screws that keep the insert and the Petzl ring together. So here we have the screw and the insert. On the insert, there's a little notch that fits onto the Petzl ring only in one direction. So be sure that when you're putting this together, you get those lined up properly. You don't want to offset those, the insert or the little notch in a different direction. It won't go together very smoothly. We also want to inspect this small red O-ring around the head of the screw for the Petzl ring itself. We just want to make sure that it still has, its desired width, and that it's not cracked or damaged in any way. Now that we've checked the Petzl rings, remove the ripcords, we will bring the bench arm down, and we will make sure that our webbing stacks are tight and that there's no space in them. This is also known as the incoming gear hitch test. Keep in mind, while handling the webbing on QuickFlight, you always want to pull both webbings at the same time. Pulling the webbings on QuickFlight at different frequencies or different intervals is going to cause one stack of the webbing to be tighter or looser than the other. So when pulling the webbing out on QuickFlight, I always just pull them out together, same as I would on any other device. Just try to kind of pinch them together as you pull them from the unit. So then I will I'm actually going to remove the shaft nut, the security bolt, and our standard housing bolts. I'll start with the security bolt. Shaft nut, housing bolts, make sure that all the threads are loose. On QuickFlight, you will notice this right off the bat. The housing bolts are much longer. That is because, as you can see from the side profile of this device, we have two central plates. And that's to accommodate for the second webbing that we've put into place. So that's where the added height is coming from there. And to be able to clamp the housings together, we obviously need to make our housing bolts and security bolts much longer. So now we will remove the spring side housing half. Always want to make sure that the housings are in good condition. Always want to look around the inside edges, around the nozzle, for any cracking or any abnormal damage. I'll set this off to the side. And now we'll remove our isolation insert. As you can see, many of these processes, as far as the housing and the bolts and the housing insert removal go, they're very similar, just with some slight differences. Remove the much more narrow cover plate spacer, PSD cover plate spacer. You can see that this piece is black in color, as opposed to the somewhat white cream color of the standard PSD spacer. The difference in color is also going to help when it comes to being able to tell the difference between these two parts. We'll set that to the side. And now, as we get ready to remove the webbing and the roller assembly, and eventually the spring, we'll secure the device by locking it in place with the bench arm. And then we are going to remove our nozzle assembly. As you can see on this nozzle assembly, given that there are two webbings now, we have maintained the standard nozzle design for the top and bottom halves of the nozzle assembly, and we have implemented this center section. This allows us to use two webbings at the same time with two pre-existing parts. The only new parts that we have here on our nozzle assembly would be the center section and the elongated clip. We will perform the same inspections on these clips as you would on any other device. And then before we begin to remove our webbing, we're actually going to remove our much more than two pieces, but it's the taller roller assembly. So this device actually utilizes the same metal rollers as ZipStop IR and QuickJump XL have, but we've implemented a center spacer as well here, which bumps the spacing out and to match where the webbing locations are. So this will be serviced the same way as those rollers are as well, with the grease being removed and repacked and cleaned up each year for service. Now we will begin by removing both webbing assemblies. So as you can see, I'm going to pull both at the same time. So I'll pull them. Luckily, I got both of them to come out at the same time, so the timing on those was done well. One thing that, just as with most other devices, you can use a pin to pin it to your service bench, or you can still use a flathead to hold the webbing in place as the shackles and shackle pins are being removed. One thing you want to be sure of as you remove each individual webbing assembly, one thing that I like to do is to make sure that they're untangled. So when it comes time to do the webbing inspection, I do not have to untangle them at that point and can do the inspection fluidly. Both webbing assemblies are in fact the same, so if you can't keep them separated from the top or bottom or left or right webbing assemblies, that's okay. Now that both webbing assemblies have been removed, I'm going to back wind this PSD a little bit just to release the tension from the flathead, and then forgot to take my shackles out. I'm going to make sure that both short webbing loops are guided into position. We do this to make sure that the short webbing loops don't get caught on the top or bottom edges of the guide band. This is a good practice for all other devices as well. Now we're going to let the spring unwind. You always want to do this in a controlled manner, whether it's on QuickFlight or any other device, to prevent any damage to the spring. Once the spring is unwound, you can release the bench arm, and then we will begin by removing the PSD rim spacer screws. You'll see as I remove these, you'll notice that these screws are actually much longer in length than the standard or original PSD cover plate screws. There's a diagram within the manual that shows these two screws side by side, so you can very clearly see the differences between the two. The PSD rim spacer screw, in addition to its length, also has a black head on it. The standard PSD screw does not have this, so a couple different ways to tell the differences between them. To cover the PSD rim spacer, we have added this piece because of the additional height or width of the actual QuickFlight retraction spring. You'll see here in just a moment, if you're not following along in the manual, that this retraction spring is significantly wider than any other retraction spring that we've ever used. In addition to its actual width, the PEM stud, or where the retraction spring nut screws onto, is actually offset from the center of the band itself. If this spring is installed incorrectly, you'll not be able to, so for example, if you install this spring into the drum, we'll just try to do this quickly. The stud itself does not line up with the hole. So actual installation of that spring in the incorrect fashion is very difficult to achieve. So a couple different things that have been implemented with the QuickFlight, in addition to lessening the probability of the spring being installed incorrectly. Next, we will do a small or quick visual inspection of the inside of the plastic spring drum. As most of you know, this consists almost entirely of looking for any type of cracking, which this drum does not have. So next, to show you further into the device, I will actually be removing the plastic drum. For the QuickFlight device, the removal of the retraction spring, the PSD, and the central plate are all part of the standard service. So, you know, with the addition of these new parts, we do have a few extra steps as well. So here we have our central plate with the handle, which also has a secondary guide band attached to it. This guide band is attached to this and this piece only, so if I lift up on this central plate, with the exception of this central plate spacer, which may or may not come up with that each time, this is what you see here. There's nothing holding it on or clamping it down to the device once these longer housing bolts have been removed. And then, as you can see here, we have a very new part. This is our webbing stack spacer. This piece keeps both of the webbing assemblies separated entirely, and allows us the same position as most of you have experienced with other devices to install the short webbing loop onto this as well. The reason that the QuickFlight requires for the PSD assembly to be removed is because we need to check the torque on these 4 stack spacer bolts or hub bolts each year, which is 18 Newton meters. And to check the torque on these, there's a small slot in the side of this piece of billet underneath these guide plates, where you can actually slide a flathead screwdriver or another type of holding tool into this. So we'll find that slot, which is right here, and then this will actually allow me to use the central plate boss, or this threaded hole here, will actually support the tool and keep this from spinning as I use the torque wrench to torque these bolts down. Torquing these bolts down without anything holding this spacer in place, I've noticed is very difficult. So I would always recommend putting this tool in place unless you have someone else there to hold the spacer for you. And then we will torque each of these 4 bolts to 18 Newton meters. We'll do this kind of in an alternating pattern, just to make sure that everything is done evenly. That would be, there we go. And then I'll just kind of hold on to the hub just for a little bit extra support, and then move on to this bolt back here. Okay. All right, and now that each of these bolts have been torqued, we can go ahead and start reassembling everything. Couple other things that I want to point out at this particular point are the webbing stack spacer does have a small circlip or retaining ring right around the shaft, just for some extra support to limit how much this stack spacer can actually move. We always just want to make sure that this clip is in position, that it is present. You will need to remove this clip in the event that you do need to do a full disassembly on the device. In addition to that, we also have this the mount for QuickFlight. So here we have a couple small rubber washers, and then we have the actual mount itself, which is this black piece. The actual mounting pin itself is held into place, or actually has kind of a bit of a seal on the inside with these O-rings. So as you notice, sometimes it can be kind of difficult to remove, but that's good for us in terms of this mount. So here we actually have two different sized O-rings. In the event that you need to remove these O-rings, if they're damaged or cracked or not present, then you want to be sure that you have the right sized O-ring going into these locations. This center O-ring here is the large O-ring, and the O-ring on both ends of this pin are both small O-rings. I'm sure that if you stretch them enough, you can get them to fit, but it will not create the secure fit within the mount. So be sure that the correct parts are being used for each of these locations. Go ahead and put the pin back into the mount. The upper, well, both of the holes on the mount itself are the same size, so in the event that one end of the mount is showing more wear than another, during service you are able to rotate them to just kind of make it look a little bit nicer for your customer. Go ahead and put these rubber washers back on. And then we'll just put that end back onto the central plate. You'll notice that this secondary central plate does not have a handle. This is made solely for holding this mount in place. And then we can go ahead and add on our central plate spacer. Just like this top central plate, the central plate spacer actually has no part that is bolted into it or clipped onto it that keeps this piece installed. It's simply the central plates create a, they sandwich the spacer in place. So once this central plate or housing bolts have been removed, the central plate spacer is completely free. So just be careful during service to not knock that piece around too much, or it's, could be just easy to kind of knock out of position. So just keep in mind that that piece is loose once the bolts have been removed. Next, we are going to reinstall our short webbing loop and our retaining pin. You'll notice on QuickFlights during your first service, or as you're recording a video for your certificates, that the space within the hub on the webbing stack spacer where the retaining pin is located does have a little bit of play. So once it's installed, it does tend to not stay in that exact position, and that is because once we install our PSD, the underside of the PSD will actually encase or go around the face of the retaining pin itself. So the pin will sit closer or within the underside of the plastic spring drum. That is actually something that has been retained from previous devices as well. As some of you know, that is also how the retaining pin is held into place on TrueBlue, ZipStop, and Quick Jump devices. So we will go ahead and reinstall our PSD assembly. Just kind of roughly line up the holes on our drum with the holes on the hub. And then we will reuse our PSD inner screws. If you don't know this already, the PSD inner screws are actually designed to be used up to 15 cycles. So you can remove and reinstall the PSD inner screws given that they have not been damaged up to 15 times. So just keep that in mind as you're going through service, or if that's something new to you, to just try to begin practicing that with the PSD inner screws. They do not require replacement during every service or every time the PSD is changed. So once I have all of the PSD inner screws tight, I will torque each of them to 2.5 Newton meters. And then I will just try to find, on QuickFlight devices, or on the QuickFlight and QuickFlight XL, I like to keep track of where the location of the short webbing loops, just because there are 2 of them. As I get closer to getting ready to install the webbing, I want to make sure that these short webbing loops are both in a position where I can most easily reinstall the webbing and not have to worry about one being wrapped in the opposite direction from the other. So I just want to make sure that they're always in line with each other and the same length and at the same position. So just kind of try to keep an eye on those as you're performing your service. Next, we are going to reinstall our retraction spring. So I will install the notch on the spring into the shaft itself, and then I'm going to rotate to where I can see the hole on the PSD, and then I will just drop the spring into place. And next I'm going to reinstall the retraction spring nut to the outside of the drum. Be sure it's torqued to 2.5 Newton meters. Now that the retraction spring has been reinstalled, we are going to reinstall our PSD cover plate. As you know, on all standard PSDs, there are actually 10 holes for the 5 PSD cover plate screws to screw into. On QuickFlight, with the addition of the rim spacer, 5 of those locations are actually taken up by the screws that hold the rim spacer in place. So when you're installing your cover plate spacer, just be sure to line the holes up with the holes that are open. In the event that that one of the PSD screw hole locations becomes cracked, you will actually need to be replacing your PSD, as all 10 PSD screw hole locations need to be utilized for QuickFlight devices. We'll go ahead and set the central plate on, cover plate spacer, and then we will reinstall all 5 of the cover plate screws. Remember, on these cover plate screws, to reinstall them about 3/4 of the way, and then once you get to your last screw location, you can bolt that one all the way down, and then go back and make sure that each one of them is tight. For those of you using a powered screwdriver to reinstall these cover plate screws, one thing that I like to do to make sure that I don't over tighten these screws, which eventually causes the PSD screw location to crack, is to very, very lightly hold on to these screwdrivers. I hold on to it light enough to where you'll see here in a moment, as I press the button to tighten the screw, the actual turn, or the tool itself will spin in my hand instead of that energy being transferred into the screw. So as the screw becomes tight, the tool itself will twist in your hand, and that prevents the cracking of PSDs for, you know, just the installation of these screws. So just a little tip for those using power tools to install those screws. Now that we've finished reinstalling our PSD cover plate screws, we are going to wind the spring up. So to do this, we would just want to make sure that we don't clamp down on any of the cover plate or rim spacer screw locations or the retraction spring nut. And that's done just to eliminate the possibility of compressing or cracking the PSD. In addition to that, that's one of the main reasons why we clamp our winding tool about halfway up on the cover plate as well. So just a little bit extra rigidity with using the cover plate as a clamping point for the winder. The first wind here, I'm just going to make sure that I get these short webbing loop spacers in their correct locations. Okay, and then I'm just going to actually hold on to both short webbing loops as I do the first wind, and then I will let them go. The noise that we're hearing here from the retraction spring are just the bands of the spring slipping over themselves. So nothing is being damaged. It's just a noise that we experience a lot during service. So this is something a lot of you may have experienced already, but and now that the spring has been wound, I've removed the winder. I'm going to bring my bench arm down, and the spring is actually wound as far as it can go. So we want to actually begin to locate our short webbing loops. There's one, and there's the other. So what I'm actually going to do is one of these short webbing loops wound in the opposite direction. So I just need to push that back into the device, flip both, or turn both of them to where I can get them to come out of from underneath the PSD or between the guide plates at the same time. So this is where the addition of the webbings becomes most apparent, is during the installation and removal process. So we found this guy and this upper short webbing loop. Okay, so now that I have both short webbing loops pulled out in the same location, and I have relieved the device of one rotation, I will pin the short webbing loops actually along the bottom short webbing loop. The reason that I'm going to use the bottom short webbing loop is because this location has more support of the flathead. If you're using a flathead, I would suggest using it within the bottom short webbing loop. If you would like to pin it through the top, I would suggest using the service bench board pin and pinching it to the bench itself. The reason that I would suggest doing it this way is because given that the top central plate and webbing spacer are not held in place with their bolts yet, if you use the flathead through the top short webbing loop, it can actually cause this central plate spacer, this black spacer through the middle of the central plates, to actually bend slightly inward and just doesn't provide the same support. So that's what I like to do there. Next, I will install both of the shackles. And then we will actually perform our webbing inspection as you would for any other device. As you can see on the QuickFlight, we have a much smaller version of the hand grip or the attachment point. This location here with the red 6-bar tack and the black webbing is actually where this webbing will attach to the Petzl ring itself. So you do the same inspection as you would for any other webbing in any device. In addition to the red 6-bar tack stitching, the black and red combination indicates that this is a 12.5 meter upper webbing. So in the QuickFlight, now that we have a upper webbing that is separate from the ripcord itself, that makes these webbing assemblies modular. And then we will begin to reinstall our webbing assemblies. So we will insert the French twist into the shackle, and then just for demonstration purposes today, I will be using new shackle pins. If you are able to thoroughly clean your shackle pin that was initially removed from the device, you are able to reuse those shackle pins if you apply Loctite 243. If you need any further instruction on the reuse or the cleaning process of shackle pins, please feel free to contact me. Now we will install our secondary webbing. New shackle pin. And just to double check on your shackle pins, guys, when you tighten these down all the way, make sure that you can feel the bottom of the shackle pin itself. If the shackle pin, if you can't feel it, you should just feel like a small bump on the underside of the shackle. If you can't feel the shackle pin, double check the shackle with a new one just to make sure that the part has not become damaged over time. Now that both webbings have been attached to the shackles, I am going to relieve the pressure from the flathead by turning the spring drum counterclockwise, and then I'm going to grab both webbings and make sure that I have them pulled taut and started at an even rate, and then I'm going to let these feed into the device at the same. I'll try to do my best to get them to go into the device at the same speed. So as you can see here, I am off about 2 or 3 inches. So the adjustment, the way that we adjust the webbings on QuickFlight is to pull both webbing stacks and then to pull the webbing that appears to be more taut than the one that is not. I've found that in doing so, I have been able to get the webbing bar tacks to line up evenly. So during this process, just know that if you do let the webbings in at a slightly different rate, the end result can vary. but it's not, you don't have to redo the entire process. It can be adjusted. Now that both webbings have been fully retracted back into the device, I will begin by reinstalling the bottom half of the nozzle. The central nozzle body, and then the top half of the nozzle with the clip. Make sure during the installation process of the nozzle that you are careful not to pinch the webbing with the nozzle bodies themselves. That will obviously cause the webbing to become pinched and could cause damage to the webbing. Okay. Next we will release the bench arm and install our housing insert, our isolation insert. Make sure that roller doesn't roll away, and our top or side housing half, spring side housing half. And then we will drop all of our security and housing bolts into place. And then just be sure to torque all of your housing bolts and your security bolt to 18 Newton meters. I always like to do the security bolt in much shorter pulls of the torque wrench, just to make sure that if I'm doing a larger movement with the torque wrench, I feel that I personally am more inclined or have a much greater possibility of stripping the bolt. So with the security bolt specifically, I do much smaller movements as I'm tightening or torquing this bolt down. And now we're going to move on to the gear side service. Now that we've flipped the device over to the braking side of the device, we will begin disassembly and removal of the housing. So we will get our 18 millimeter socket, our security bolt bit, our 6 millimeter hex key, and we will remove all of these bolts. So on the braking side, you'll see I didn't remove each of the housing bolts. That's because on the QuickFlight, on the braking side, we did not have to use longer bolts. That is done just to make sure that both of the central plates and the spring side housing are all attached together. The braking side housing assembly is separate from those. So you're able to remove the housing with the housing bolts and security bolts in place on the braking side. And then, as usual, we will remove our isolation insert, inspecting for any cracking, and the idler assembly. And then we will begin by cleaning the idler assembly off, just as you would for any other head rush device. Personally, when I'm cleaning off the gear side or braking side components, I always like to remove the majority of the grease before I start cleaning the teeth out. or any of the smaller crevices on the idler assembly. The reason for this is because, well, one, I clean the parts more than I should, but it is also to prevent the possibility of just moving old grease back into those locations. So as I'm cleaning, I am always sure to remove as much grease from the brush during the process to prevent that from happening. So we'll go through the small gear of the idler and the large gear as well. And then we will spray this off with isopropyl alcohol and wipe this off with our towel. It's nice and smooth. On some of these brand new idlers, it's important to note that they're, given how new they are, it's important to note that you, from time to time, will end up with a small amount of noise from the bearing. This is just because mainly the bearings themselves are not broken in yet, and usually takes a little bit of time for that noise to go away. So just keep that in mind as you're going through service of much newer devices. It's not abnormal for them to have just a very slight sound from those bearings. So main portion of our braking side of the QuickFlight device. As you can see here, for those that are familiar with True Blue Speed, we have maintained the lightweight drum gear. As you can see here, the edges are shaved off. This outer profile here from about the gear, or a little bit behind the gear teeth towards the edges, is much thinner. It's just that, it's a lightweight drum gear. We also have lightweight drum gear bolts and a lightweight cast drum. We will not be doing a full disassembly today, but you're able to see each of these parts within the service manual on their own. So just to get a better feel for the part and the way that they look, just take the time to review these parts within the service manual if you're not familiar with them. We will continue with the cleaning just by removing most of the grease off of these main surfaces. So I'll just start with the actual top of the gear teeth themselves, or on the drum gear, and then I'll move down to this magnet plate, kind of work from the inside edge towards the gear teeth, and then you'll notice on these lightweight devices that utilize the lightweight cast drum, lightweight drum gear, there is a very small space between the magnet plate and the drum gear itself. So as I'm cleaning the devices that utilize these parts, I make sure that the bristles of those brushes get down underneath those gear teeth to get as much debris or grease or grime out of there as I possibly can without fully disassembling the gear side of this device. So now that I've cleaned off the majority of those surfaces, I will begin to go through the gear teeth themselves. Make sure, guys, when you're cleaning out these drum gear teeth, that you get the bristles of the brush that you're using to clean them with all the way to the back of the gear tooth. You really want to make sure that all of that old grease or anything that might be stuck in the back of those teeth is being removed. Now that we've removed as much of the grease from the gear side of the device as we can, we will spray the whole gear side with isopropyl alcohol. You can spray the entire device with the alcohol. Obviously, you know, we don't want to overdo it, but you know, that's what I tend to do when I clean. I like to use a lot of the alcohol, but it also ensures that the surfaces that we're going to be moving forward with and the gear components that have just been serviced are as clean as they can possibly be. So just be sure as you're cleaning that the majority of these crucial components have been cleaned as best as they can be. Now that the cleaning has been completed, I'm going to check the torque on all of the lightweight drum gear bolts. And to do this, we will be using a 15 Newton meter torque wrench. That is obviously varying somewhat from the 9 Newton meters that's utilized on all of our standard line of devices that do not utilize any of the lightweight drum gear or braking components. And then we will move forward with the magnet check. So just be sure to press pretty firmly on the back side of these magnets. Our ultimate goal here with using only our hands is to try to make a magnet loose. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to find, are loose magnets. But if your hand is able to cause one of these magnets to become loose, then we will proceed with re-gluing the magnets back onto the magnet plate or the cast drum. Our next inspection is going to be to check our star locks underneath the rotor. Obviously, to check the top side is very simple. We've got 6 on the top and the underside of the rotor itself. So we will look underneath the rotor. We got 2, 4, 6. One thing that I like to do when I'm checking for the star lock specifically, obviously this lightweight cast drum is half of the amount of posts. As you can see here, the standard drum used to utilize 8 of these posts. So there would be one here, 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 and here. With the lightweight drum gear cast drum, excuse me, it makes it much easier to do this star lock inspection than on previous devices. And then lastly, we're going to make sure that the deployment of our rotor arms is uninterrupted, that we don't have too much resistance from anything other than the reaction springs themselves. And we're good to go. We will just add new grease to the drum gear. And to the rotor gear as well. Just remember to use the grease in moderation. Obviously, be sure that you're using the correct grease that's outlined within your service manual and all service manuals, and that you're not using too much of it. Too much grease promotes, the adhesion and the gathering of dust and debris within the braking side of the device, which is what we ultimately want to prevent. So just be sure to use the grease in moderation and not to use too much. Lastly, on the gear side, I will reinstall our idler. Firstly, by putting it onto the shaft and making sure that the teeth on the idler are meshing with the drum gear, and then slightly pressing down on the back side of the idler and pushing and slightly rotating the idler until it's fully seated, and then reinstalling the isolation insert, making sure that that is fully seated as well, and the three main piece roller assembly. And then to do so, we will actually be switching hands. We will pull both webbing assemblies out of the way, and then pushing the roller down into place, Make sure that if you are going to choose to reinstall the roller assembly as is, fully assembled, that the small plastic spacers do not fall down into the device. With the additional height of the QuickFlight, it is not nearly as simple to retrieve them because of the secondary central plate and central plate spacer. So just be very careful when reinstalling your metal roller. Next, we will add or reinstall the braking side housing. So same way that you would install any other housing on any other device, we'll line it up with the roller and the top, or in this case, the bottom nozzle body, and then make sure that those are aligned and seated within the housing, and then just making the slight adjustments that you need to get the idler aligned within the housing.
Still going with the knife.
And then we will tighten down all of the housing bolts and the security bolt, and then we will torque each of them down. The shaft nut to 47 Newton meters, and each of the housing bolts to 18 Newton meters. Okay. Now that the braking side service has been completed and the housing reinstalled, this is usually the point where you would begin testing. For QuickFlight devices, the drop testing will be performed with both webbings at the same time, without the Petzl rings or the ripcord being installed. So before you go to test your QuickFlight device, you will just be testing with these two lanyards attached to your weight. So no need to install the Petzl ring or the ripcord prior to testing. To reinstall our ripcords, first I will begin by installing the Petzl ring itself. And I'll grab the lanyard. I'll slide the lanyard onto the Petzl ring, and the Petzl ring, the black Petzl ring insert with the notch, I'll just slide down into place, and then slide the bolt into place, and I will, wrong T-handle, tighten these screws. And today you'll see that we're working with, I pointed this out earlier, but we have the 12.5 meter upper webbing, and this is the 2 meter ripcord. The 1 and 2 meter ripcords are both compatible with the 12.5 meter upper webbing. There is also a low mount webbing upper, which is compatible only with the 1 meter ripcord. The difference between the 1 and 2 meter ripcord, aside from the obvious difference in length, is the coloring of the lanyards on that ripcord. They will be blue in color. Now that we have gone over the service for the QuickFlight device, after reviewing and studying the manual, you'll now be ready to service QuickFlight devices. Please be sure after you have reviewed the manual and hopefully seen this video to submit a video to me of you servicing and performing the testing for the QuickFlight device. It does not need to be this same configuration. It just needs to be a configuration of a QuickFlight, whether that's QuickFlight or QuickFlight XL. Those videos and certificates will be required for you to be able to service QuickFlights. Without that certificate, you will not be authorized to service this equipment. A couple things to go over briefly about QuickFlight Service. Just some tips from what I've experienced, as I too am very new to the service of this device, are one, as we went over briefly as we were reinstalling the webbing, just be patient with it. Reinstalling the webbing can be slightly frustrating, as it's a relatively easy task, but just getting them to align sometimes can be a little bit tricky. So just be patient, and then just practice the intermittent pulling of one stack over the other, or really trying to let them feed into the device at the same rate, which I believe for most of us will come with some time and practice with the device. Secondly, now there are 2 guide bands. As most of you know, over time, having the device develop a slight scraping sound is not ideal for either ourselves or the customer. So just be very patient as well when trying to adjust the guide bands. As you will notice, I actually at the beginning of this video, as I was servicing the spring side of the device, I actually the device developed a small scraping sound after I had begun to reinstall the components. This noise tends to go away with QuickFlight specifically because of all the additional parts. There's actually a slight bit of compression that happens once these bolts are reinstalled and torqued to spec. So as you're servicing, you might notice this slight scraping sound, but once the spring side housing has been fully reassembled, in most cases that I've experienced, the scraping goes away almost entirely. So just keep that in mind as you're going through service. Just be sure not to make too many adjustments to the guide bands before reassembling everything or putting the housing back on, because you will most likely find that the slight bit of compression will resolve that issue for you. With that being said, thank you all for your time. Please feel free to reach out and contact me as each of you begin to work and service QuickFlight devices. Thank you very much.